The wind that tore through the valley of Cottonwood Bend in the year 1858 was not a welcoming thing. It did not whisper. It scoured. It carried the grit of the high plains and the chill of the mountains, stripping the moisture from the earth and the hope from the soul. Here, the law was a rumor that thinned out somewhere east of the Brazos, and a person's life was often measured by the reliability of their rifle and the sharpness of their instincts. Clara Whitmore stood in the center of the small clearing she had claimed, her boots sinking slightly into the half-frozen mud. She was 22 years old, though the sun and the wind of the last 3 weeks on the trail had begun to etch a weariness into her face that belonged to a woman twice her age. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, looking at the pile of rough-hewn timber she had managed to drag from the tree line. It looked pitifully small against the vast, gray emptiness of the Texas horizon. "It is enough to start," she said aloud, her voice cracked, dry and thin in the silence. There was no one to hear her but the old mule, Barnaby, who stood with his head hung low near the wagon, chewing on a patch of dry scrub grass. Clara did not mind the silence. In fact, she had ridden nearly 200 miles to find it. Back in the settlement, noise meant demands. It meant the heavy, drunken voice of her stepfather, Arthur, listing the debts her mother had left behind. It meant the wheedling, suffocating tone of the shopkeeper, Mr. Higgins, whom Arthur had decided she would marry to settle those accounts. Mr. Higgins was a man of 50 with wet hands and a gaze that made Clara feel like a piece of livestock being appraised for slaughter. She had chosen the wind instead. She had taken her mother's hidden savings, $70 in gold coins and silver, packed the wagon in the dead of night, and driven west until the road ended and the game trails began. She wanted a place where no one owned a piece of paper with her name on it. She wanted a cabin with a door she could bolt from the inside. But wanting a cabin and building one were two very different things. Earlier that week, she had stopped at the last trading post, a leaning wooden structure that smelled of cured tobacco and stale grease. The woman behind the counter, a widow named Martha Briggs with eyes as hard as flint, had looked Clara up and down with open skepticism. "You plan to stake a claim out by the bend?" Martha had asked, wiping a glass with a rag that looked dirtier than the counter. "Alone?" "Yes, ma'am," Clara had replied, keeping her chin level. "You are a fool, then," Martha said flatly. "The land out there is hard, the water is deep, and the men who ride patrol, well, let us just say the Vigilance Committee is more interested in what they can take than who they can protect. And that is not mentioning the Comanche." Clara had stiffened. "I can shoot, ma'am, and I work hard," Martha had snorted. "Bullets run out, and work does not keep a throat from being cut in the dark. But it is your funeral, girl. Just do not say I did not warn you." Clara shook the memory away. She picked up the heavy iron axe. It was a man's tool, the handle smooth and slick with use. Purchased from a traveler who had turned back east, she swung it onto her shoulder and walked toward the grove of cottonwoods and oaks near the creek. The first step was always the hardest. From the ridge line, 500 yards away and concealed within the deep shadow of a limestone overhang. Sage watched her. He was still as the stone he leaned against. To the casual eye, he might have been a trick of the light, a shadow that did not move with the sun. He was a Comanche warrior, a scout for his band, tasked with watching the movements of the encroaching white settlers. There had been rumors, dark whispers carried on the wind of men burning ranches and blaming the tribes to justify a slaughter. Sage was here to see the truth, but for the last 3 days, the truth had been a solitary white woman struggling to chop down a tree. He adjusted his position slightly, the leather of his leggings making no sound against the rock. He was a man of 30 winters, his body honed by a life of constant motion. His hair was long and black, tied back with a simple leather thong, and his face was a map of sharp angles and guarded expressions. He had been given the name Sage by a trader years ago because of his silence and his knowledge of the healing lands, and the name had stuck even among some of his own people when dealing with outsiders. He lowered his spyglass, a prized possession taken from a soldier years ago. He frowned. "She is alone," he murmured to himself in his own tongue. It made no sense. White women did not come to the frontier alone. They came in herds, surrounded by loud men with loud guns. They were guarded, kept in wagons, hidden behind walls. This one was different. She slept under her wagon. She ate cold beans from a tin, and she swung an axe with a determination that was both impressive and pitiful. He watched as she struck the trunk of a stubborn oak. The axe bit deep, but it stuck. She tugged at it, her boot slipping in the mud. She fell hard onto her backside. Sage felt a strange twitch in his chest. A part of him, the warrior part, knew he should leave. She was an invader. Her presence meant others would follow. But another part of him, a part that had known the crushing weight of loneliness since his wife had passed to the spirit world 4 years ago during the fever, could not look away. She did not scream. She did not throw the axe. She sat in the mud for a long moment, her head bowed. Then she stood up. She wiped her hands on her skirt, gripped the handle, and pulled the blade free. She struck the tree again. Sage watched her until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. He should be tracking the riders he had seen 2 days ago, the men with the new rifles. But he found himself wondering if the woman would manage to get a fire started before the temperature dropped. The next 4 days were a blur of exhaustion for Clara. Every muscle in her body screamed. Her hands, once soft from sewing and housework, were now raw. Blisters had formed, burst, and formed again, layering into the beginnings of calluses. She had decided to build a simple lean-to first, something to protect her supplies, before attempting the main cabin, but even that required timber. She had felled 3 trees, stripping the branches with a hatchet until her arms felt like lead. The problem was moving them. "Come on, Barnaby," Clara coaxed, clicking her tongue. She had harnessed the mule to the log with a length of thick hemp rope. The mule dug his hooves in and pulled. The log groaned against the earth, plowing a furrow through the dead grass and mud. Clara pushed from behind. Her shoulder jammed against the rough bark. "Push!" she gritted out, her teeth clenched. They moved 3 yards, then 5. The ground was uneven, riddled with stones and roots. Clara stumbled, her foot catching in a hidden hole. She went down, her palm slamming into the rocky soil to break her fall. A sharp rock sliced across the heel of her left hand. She gasped, pulling her hand back. Blood welled up, bright and stark against the dirt. It flowed quickly, dripping onto her skirt. Clara sat back on her heels, clutching her wrist. The pain was sharp, hot, and immediate. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, not from the pain, but from the frustration. She was so small, the world was so big, and the log was so heavy. She looked around the empty valley. The wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound. "Is there no one?" she whispered. "Is there no mercy in this place?" There was no answer, only the rustle of dry leaves. Clara took a deep breath. She ripped a strip of fabric from her petticoat. Her clothes were already ruined, so it hardly mattered, and wrapped her hand tightly. She tied the knot with her teeth, pulling it until the pressure dulled the throb. "Get up, Clara," she told herself. Her voice was fierce. "Get up! Arthur said you would be dead in a week. Do not prove him right." She stood up. She went back to the log. She put her uninjured shoulder against the wood. Heave. Sage had seen the fall. He had started to rise from his crouch, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt, not as a weapon, but as a tool to help. He had taken 1 step out of the tree line before he stopped himself. If he showed himself now, she would be terrified. To her, he was a monster. The stories the white people told about the Comanche were filled with blood and fire. If he walked into her camp, she would likely try to shoot him, and he would be forced to defend himself. He watched as she bound her hand. He saw the flash of white petticoat. He saw the way her shoulders shook, just for a moment, before she straightened her spine. She was strong, stronger than any white woman he had ever seen. He waited until night fell. The moon was a thin sliver, offering little light. Clara had collapsed near her small fire. wrapped in blankets, too tired to even erect the canvas tent she usually slept in. The mule was tethered nearby, dozing. Sage moved like smoke. He crossed the open ground without snapping a twig. The wind masked the soft sound of his moccasins on the grass. He approached the unfinished frame of her refuge. He looked at the logs she had dragged. They were cut roughly, the ends jagged. She was working with brute force, not leverage. He walked to the pile of timber she had yet to move. It would take her 2 days to drag these to the site. Sage holstered his weapon. He bent down, gripping the end of a heavy oak trunk. He was strong, his power coming from his legs and back. He hauled the log across the clearing, placing it neatly beside the others she had positioned. He went back for another and another. He worked in silence, a ghost in the darkness. He did not move them all. That would be too obvious, too frightening. He moved enough to save her a day of breaking her back. When he was done, he stood over her sleeping form. The fire had died down to embers. In the faint glow, her face looked young and smooth, the worry lines smoothed away by sleep. Her bandaged hand rested on her chest. He felt a strange urge to touch her hair, which had spilled out of its pins and lay like spun gold on the blanket. He clenched his fist, resisting the pull. He was a guardian, not a lover. He was a shadow, not a man she could know. He reached into the pouch at his waist. He pulled out a single feather. It was a hawk's feather, brown and barred with white. It represented vision. It represents the hunter who watches from above. He moved to the tree nearest to where she slept, with a small knife. He made a tiny incision in the bark, just deep enough to hold the quill. He placed the feather there, high enough that a wolf could not reach it, but low enough that she would see it when she stood. It was a message. "You are not alone. I see you." He looked at her one last time, memorizing the rise and fall of her breath. Then he turned and vanished into the night, leaving only the wind behind him. The sun rose cold and pale. Clara woke with a start, her hand throbbing in time with her heartbeat. She sat up, groggy, the stiffness in her back making her groan. She reached for the canteen and took a swig of water. She needed to get back to work. The logs would not move themselves. She stood and turned toward the wood pile and froze. 3 massive logs, ones she had planned to tackle today, were already sitting near the foundation of the cabin. They were stacked neatly, parallel to the ones she had moved yesterday. Clara blinked. She rubbed her eyes. She looked again. They were still there. A chill that had nothing to do with the wind raced down her spine. She spun around, scanning the tree line. "Hello," she called out. Her hand went to the revolver tucked in her belt. "Is anyone there?" Silence. She walked toward the logs cautiously. There were footprints in the soft earth. They were not boot prints. They were moccasin prints, flat, soft-soled, and large. Her heart hammered against her ribs. An Indian. A Comanche. The stories Martha Briggs had told flooded her mind. Tales of scalping, of kidnapping, of burning. She backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. She had been watching while she slept. Someone had been here, standing right over her, but they had moved the logs. Why would a savage move logs for her? Why would a killer help her build a house? Clara lowered the gun slowly. She looked around the camp again, her eyes searching for a threat. Instead, her gaze caught something fluttering on the trunk of the oak tree she slept beneath. She stepped closer. It was a feather, a hawk's feather, distinct and beautiful, wedged carefully into the bark. Clara reached out, her fingers trembling. She did not touch it. She just hovered her hand near it, feeling the impossible reality of it. It wasn't a threat. A threat was a knife in the door or a dead animal in the water. This was delicate. She looked out toward the dense forest, where the shadows were deep and impenetrable. "Who are you?" she whispered to the trees. She did not run. She did not pack the wagon. The fear was there. Certainly, a cold knot in her stomach. But mixed with it was something else. Someone had seen her struggle. Someone had seen her bleeding hand. And that someone, whoever he was, had chosen to lend his strength instead of taking her life. Clara Whitmore turned back to her cabin. She looked at the logs the gift left in the night. She tightened the bandage on her hand. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying on the wind toward the ridge. She picked up her axe. If he was watching, she would show him that she was worth the help. She would show him that she could stand. 3 days passed. The cabin began to take shape. It was small, only 12 feet by 10 feet, but the walls were rising. Clara worked with a renewed intensity. She no longer felt the crushing weight of isolation. The valley felt different now. It felt shared. She fell into a rhythm. Wake, eat, work, eat, sleep. But now, every time she stopped to wipe the sweat from her brow, her eyes would drift to the tree line. She never saw him, but she felt him. It was late afternoon when the peace was broken. Clara was mixing mud and grass to chink the gaps between the lower logs. Her dress was stiff with dirt, her hair tied back in a messy knot. She heard the sound of hooves before she saw the riders. She stood up quickly, grabbing her rifle from where it leaned against the wagon wheel. She moved to put the wagon between herself and the approaching sound. 3 men rode out of the brush. They were not Indians. They were white men, dressed in long dusters, their hats pulled low. They rode heavy horses and carried rifles in scabbards by their knees. Clara recognized the man in the lead. It was hard not to. He had been at the trading post the day she arrived, watching her from a corner table. He was a big man with a thick beard and eyes that looked like 2 pieces of coal pressed into dough. "Afternoon, miss," the man called out. He did not smile. "Afternoon?" Clara said. She kept her rifle leveled at the ground, but her finger was near the trigger. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" The man chuckled. It was a dry, rasping sound. "We are just the local patrol, vigilance committee, making sure the area is safe for decent folk." He rode closer. Clara stepped back, keeping the distance. "I am fine," she said. "I do not need help." The man looked at the half-built cabin. He looked at the logs Sage had moved. He looked at Clara's bandaged hand. "Built this all by yourself, did you?" he asked. There was a sneer in his voice. "Yes." Clara lied. She would not tell them about the shadow. "Impressive," the man said. "But this is a dangerous country. Little lady, lots of savages about, a woman alone. Well, things happen. I can take care of myself," Clara said firmly. The man leaned forward on his saddle horn. "See, that is the thing. We offer protection. For a fee, $10 a month. Keeps the wolves away. And the Indians—" Clara's grip on the rifle tightened. $10 a month was robbery. It was more than she had left. "I have no money for you," she said. "And I did not ask for your protection." The man's face hardened. He signaled to the other 2 men. They spread out slightly, flanking her. "Everyone pays, miss," the man said softly. "It is the cost of doing business in Cottonwood Bend. Maybe you should think about it. We will be back next week. Maybe by then, you will realize how lonely it gets out here." He tipped his hat, a mocking gesture. "Name is Pike, by the way. Harlan Pike. You remember that?" They turned their horses and rode off, kicking up a cloud of dust that drifted over Clara's garden plot. Clara watched them go until they were just specks in the distance. Her heart was pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was the darkness Martha had warned her about. This was the law of the land. She looked at her half-finished home. It felt fragile suddenly. A strong wind or a match could take it all away. She sat down on one of the logs Sage had moved. She felt small again. The bravado evaporated, leaving only the cold reality of her situation. She was one woman against a gang of men with guns. From the ridge. Sage watched the dust settle. He had his bow in his hand. An arrow knocked. He had been ready to lose it the moment one of the men touched her, but they had ridden away. He knew Harlan Pike. He knew the cruelty that lived in that man's heart. Pike was one of the men trying to start the war. Sage lowered his bow. The woman Clara sat with her head in her hands. He saw her shoulders shaking. He wanted to go to her. He wanted to tell her that Pike would not touch her while he drew breath. But he could not. Not yet. Instead, he looked at the sky. A storm was coming. Not just the wind and rain, but a storm of blood and greed. And this woman had built her house right in the path of it. Sage reached up and touched the medicine bag around his neck. He made a silent vow to the spirits of the land. Let them come, he thought, his eyes fixed on Clara's golden hair. Let them come. They will find that she is not alone. Clara took a deep breath and stood up. She wiped her face with her sleeve. She looked at the feather still stuck in the tree bark. It was trembling in the breeze, holding fast against the current. She picked up her trowel. She went back to the wall. She slapped a handful of mud into the gap between the logs. I am not leaving, she said to the empty air, and, in the silence of the canyon, it sounded like a declaration of war. The sun was beginning to dip behind the western ridge, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley floor. Clara wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of dirt across her brow. The cabin was taking shape, a rough skeleton of timber against the vast, indifferent sky. She needed more firewood. The nights were growing colder, a bone-deep chill that seeped through the canvas of the wagon and the thin walls of her unfinished home. Clara turned her attention to the pile of logs she had purchased from the trading post 3 days prior. They were older wood, gray and seasoned, likely salvaged from some abandoned structure and resold by the widow Briggs. She hefted the axe, her muscles protesting with a dull ache that had become her constant companion. She chose a thick log of oak, set it on the chopping block, and swung. The blade struck with a solid thud, but the sound was wrong. It was not the dull, dense sound of solid wood. It was a hollow knock, like striking an empty barrel. Clara frowned. She wiggled the axe blade free and struck again, harder this time. The wood split, but not cleanly. It shattered outward, revealing a cavity that had been bored out with deliberate precision. Clara dropped the axe. Her breath caught in her throat. Nestled inside the hollowed-out heart of the log was a bundle wrapped in oilskin. She looked around instinctively, her heart hammering against her ribs. The valley was empty, save for the swaying grass and the distant, watchful silhouette of the hawk circling the thermals. She knelt in the wood chips and reached into the split log. The package was heavy. She untied the twine with trembling fingers. Inside lay a book. It was a ledger, bound in cracked black leather, smelling of mildew and old tobacco. Clara opened it. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and notes written in a cramped, aggressive hand. She ran her finger down the list. March, 1858. Payment to Deputy R for silence regarding the fires. April, 1858. Purchase of deeds. Miller property. Price 0. Method accident. May, 1858. Payment to H. Pike. Removal of obstacles. And at the bottom of the page, signed with a flourish that reeked of arrogance, was a name: Silas Crow. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Silas Crow was the man who owned the cattle herds to the north, the man who was slowly buying up every inch of arable land along the river. She turned the page. There were maps, lines drawn through existing homesteads, notes on water rights, and a list of names titled "To be vacated." Her own name was not there, but the plot of land she stood on was circled in red ink. Clara slammed the book shut. Her hands were shaking violently. This was not just a log. This was a coffin nail. Someone had hidden this ledger, perhaps a clerk with a guilty conscience, or a partner who had gotten greedy and in a twist of fate. It had ended up in a pile of firewood sold to an unsuspecting woman. If Crow knew she had this, he would not send men to warn her. He would send men to bury her. A sharp crack echoed through the valley. Clara did not have time to think. Instinct, honed by fear, took over. She threw herself flat against the muddy ground behind the chopping block. A split second later, a second crack tore the air. Splinters of wood exploded from the corner of the unfinished cabin frame, inches from where her head had been a moment before. Gunfire. Clara scrambled on her belly, dragging herself toward the cover of the wagon wheels. Barnaby the mule brayed in panic, tugging at his tether. "Stay down," she whispered to herself, her face pressed into the dirt. "Stay down." The shot had come from the tree line to the east. the same place where the mysterious feather had appeared, in the dense brush of the ridge. Sage was already moving. He had seen the glint of the rifle barrel in the dying light long before Clara had. He had been watching the two men creep into position for the last hour. They were not patrolmen. They were hired guns, men who smelled of stale whiskey and cruelty. Sage could not use his rifle. The sound would give away his position. And if he killed a white man, the army would descend on his people like a plague of locusts. He had to be a ghost. He saw the gunman line up the second shot. The man was aiming for the water barrel, trying to scare the woman, to flush her out. Sage moved silently to his left, finding a heavy, jagged stone the size of a fist. He did not aim for the man. He aimed for the horse tethered loosely behind the shooter, with a motion as fluid as water. Sage hurled the stone. It flew through the twilight and struck the horse hard on the flank. The beast screamed and reared, tearing its reins free. It plunged forward, slamming into the shooter just as he pulled the trigger. The rifle went off wild, the bullet tearing harmlessly through the tree canopy. The gunman shouted, falling into the dirt as his horse bolted into the darkening woods. "Damn it!" A voice roared from the trees. "Control the animal! It is spooked!" Another voice yelled. Something hit it, down in the clearing. Clara peered through the spokes of the wagon wheel. She could not see the men, but she saw the chaos. She saw the flash of the rifle muzzle, and then she saw something else. For a heartbeat, a silhouette detached itself from the shadows near the shooter. It was tall and lithe, moving with a grace that was not human, or at least not civilized. The figure did not attack. It simply stood for a second, diverting the attention of the chaos, before melting back into the deep woods. The shooter scrambled to his feet. "There is someone else out here. Forget it," the second man yelled. "We lost the light. Pull back. We will come back when we can see what we are shooting at." The sound of retreating hooves faded into the night. Clara lay in the dirt for a long time, clutching the revolver she had pulled from her boot. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against the cold earth. Someone had intervened. The horse had not spooked on its own. She had seen that shadow. It was him, the Watcher. She shivered, but not from the cold. A strange, conflicting cocktail of emotions swirled in her chest. Terror. Certainly. She was being hunted by men who wanted her dead. But beneath the terror was a profound sense of confusion. A Comanche warrior was watching her. By all accounts, he should be the one shooting at her. Instead, he was the reason she was still breathing. She crawled back to the chopping block and retrieved the ledger. She could not keep it in the wagon. It was the first place they would look. She went to the cabin wall she had been working on. There was a section where the logs were not yet fully chinked with mud. She pried up a loose board she had intended to nail down the next day. It created a narrow, dark cavity between the inner and outer wall. She wrapped the ledger in her shawl and shoved it deep into the recess. Then, she hammered the board down with the butt of her revolver. "I am not running," she whispered. Her voice trembled, but the words were steel. "I am not running." The next morning brought a false peace. The wind had died down, leaving the air still and heavy with dust. Around noon, a carriage arrived. It was not a rough wagon like Clara's, but a black, polished buggy pulled by two bays. Two outriders flanked it, men with rifles resting casually across their saddles. One of them was Harlan Pike. Clara stood in the doorway of her half-built home, her hand resting on the pistol at her hip. The carriage stopped. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a gray suit that cost more than Clara had earned in her entire life. He had silver hair and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Whitmore," the man said, sweeping his hat off. "A pleasure. I am Silas Crow." Clara did not smile. "I know who you are, Mr. Crow. You are far from your herd." Crow walked toward her, stopping at the edge of the clearing. He looked at the cabin, his eyes lingering on the fresh wood. "I am a man who takes an interest in his neighbors," Crow said smoothly, "especially when they are young women braving the frontier alone. It is admirable, truly." He gestured to Pike. "My associate tells me you had some trouble last night. Gunfire. Just checking my powder. Clara lied. She kept her gaze steady. Crow's smile tightened at the edges. Is that so? Well? One can never be too careful. The Comanche have been active in this valley. Savages. They steal. They burn. They kill. It is why land prices are so low here. Dangerous investment. He took a step closer. In fact, I came to make you an offer. I am buying up the land along the bend to create a buffer zone. For safety, I would be willing to buy your claim. Double what you paid for the deed. I did not buy this land to sell it, Clara said. I bought it to live on it. Crow sighed, as if disappointed by a child's stubbornness. Miss Whitmore, survival is a commodity out here, and it is expensive. The trading post tells me you are low on supplies, and without protection. He trailed off, looking at the dense woods. Well, a woman alone is merely prey waiting for a predator. I have protection, Clara said. Crow raised an eyebrow. Oh, I see no men. I see no gun turrets. I have my own 2 hands, Clara said. And I have the law. Crow laughed then. It was a cold, sharp sound. The law, my dear. Look around you. I am the law. The Vigilance Committee is the law. And right now, the law says this land is unsafe. He turned back to his carriage. Think about my offer. And think about the fee the committee requires for protection. $50 a month. Retroactive to your arrival. I do not have $50, Clara said, her voice rising. Then perhaps you should sell, Crow said over his shoulder, before the Comanche decides to pay you a visit that you cannot shoot your way out of. He climbed into the carriage. As the vehicle turned, Pike lingered. He stared at Clara, his eyes dropping to her waist, then back to her face. He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto her clean threshold. We will be watching, girl, Pike rumbled. You watch out for those shadows. Clara watched them leave, her knuckles white on the handle of her gun. They knew, or at least they suspected. They wanted the land, but they wanted the ledger more. They were squeezing her, trying to crush her with fear before they used bullets. She looked toward the tree line. Are you still there? She whispered. Sage was there, but he was not watching Clara. He was 2 miles south, moving through the dense scrub brush along the creek bed. He was tracking Pike's men. He needed to know how many there were, where they camped, and what their orders were. He moved with the silence of a deer, placing his feet carefully to avoid snapping dry twigs. His eyes were fixed on the smoke rising from a temporary camp in the hollow. He did not see the trap. It was an old iron bear trap, rusted and buried beneath a layer of dead leaves and silt. It had likely been set by a fur trapper months ago, and forgotten. Sage took a step. Clang! The sound was sickening. The metal jaws snapped shut on his left calf with the force of a biting wolf. Sage gasped, the air rushing out of his lungs. Pain, white-hot and blinding, exploded up his leg. He fell to his knees, his hands gripping the earth to keep from crying out. He looked down. The teeth of the trap had bitten deep, piercing the leather of his leggings and sinking into the muscle. Blood began to well up immediately, dark and thick. He gritted his teeth, sweat popping out on his forehead. He could not stay here. The sound of the trap springing would carry. Pike's men would hear it. He reached down, his hands trembling. The spring was incredibly strong. He needed leverage. He found a thick branch. He jammed it into the mechanism of the trap. He pushed down with all his remaining strength, his vision swimming with black spots. Open! He hissed in his native tongue. Open! The jaws groaned. They pried apart. Just an inch. Sage yanked his leg free. He collapsed onto his side, panting. The leg was a mess. The skin was torn, the muscle damaged. He could move his toes, which meant the bone was likely not broken, but the wound was deep. He heard voices shouting in the distance. The men were coming. He had to move. He could not go to Clara's cabin. If he went there, he would lead the killers straight to her door. He had to draw them away. He forced himself to stand. The world tilted. He leaned heavily against a tree, biting his lip until he tasted copper. He began to limp upstream. away from the cabin, away from the safety of the high ground. He deliberately left a trail, a broken branch, a scuffed footprint. He would lead them on a chase. He dragged himself for a mile, the pain a constant, screaming companion. Finally, when the sun was gone and the moon was high, he circled back toward the creek near Clara's land. He needed water to wash the wound. He needed mud to pack it. He collapsed at the edge of the water, just inside the boundary of Clara's clearing. He washed the blood away, the cold water stinging like fire. He bound the leg with a strip of cloth from his shirt. He looked up at the cabin. A faint light glowed in the window. She was awake. She was alive. He wanted to go to the door. He wanted to collapse on that floor and let the darkness take him. But he was a warrior. He was Comanche. He would not show weakness. He dragged himself into the thicket of willows near the water. He would rest here for an hour. Just an hour. Then he would move again. The sun rose on a world that felt fragile. Clara had not slept. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind, sounded like boots on the porch. She needed water. The barrel was empty. She took the buckets and walked down to the creek. The morning air was crisp, smelling of pine and damp earth. She reached the bank where she usually drew water. She knelt on the flat stone, and then she saw it. The mud at the water's edge was churned up, as if a struggle had taken place, and trailing across the white limestone rocks was a dark, glistening path. Blood. It was not a few drops. It was a smear, a heavy trail that spoke of a serious wound. Clara stood up, the buckets forgotten. She followed the trail with her eyes. It led away from the water, dragging through the sand, and disappeared into a dense cluster of willows about 50 yards away. Her heart leaped into her throat. Sage, she whispered the name she did not know he possessed. She took a step toward the willows, then another. The fear of the previous day was gone, replaced by a sudden, gripping dread. Her shadow was hurt. The man who had moved logs for her, the man who had thrown a stone to save her life, was bleeding. She did not run back to the cabin for her gun. She ran toward the willows, her skirts gathering burrs, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She pushed aside the branches. There, curled on the damp earth, shivering violently in the morning chill, lay the warrior. His leg was wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. His face was pale, his eyes closed. Clara dropped to her knees beside him. She reached out, her hand hovering over his shoulder. You stayed, she whispered, her voice breaking. You stayed. He did not move. Clara looked at the blood, then back at his face. The choice was simple. She could leave him here, let nature or Crow's men find him, or she could bring the war into her home. She put her arm under his shoulders. Wake up, she said fiercely. I am not letting you die on my land. The weight of the warrior was a shock to Clara. He looked lean, almost gaunt, a creature of sinew and bone. But as she pulled his arm over her shoulder, he felt as heavy as the oak logs she had dragged for days. You must help me, she gritted out, her boots slipping on the wet stones of the creek bank. I cannot carry you, Sage groaned, a low, guttural sound that seemed torn from his chest. His eyes fluttered open, dark and glazed with pain, but they focused on her face. He understood. He dug his good heel into the soft earth and pushed, together. They formed a clumsy, staggering beast, moving inch by painful inch away from the exposed creek bed and toward the unfinished sanctuary of the cabin. Every step was a gamble. The sun was fully up now, bathing the valley in a ruthless, revealing light. If Pike or Crow's men were watching from the ridge, they would see them. They would see a white woman supporting a Comanche warrior, and that single image would be enough to hang them both from the nearest cottonwood. They reached the door. Clara kicked it open and practically collapsed inside, letting Sage slide down against the wall nearest the hearth. He hit the floor with a heavy thud, his head lolling back against the rough timber. Clara slammed the door and threw the heavy wooden bolt. She stood there for a moment, her chest heaving, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She was safe. No, she was trapped. She had just locked herself in a 12 by 10-foot room with a man whom half the territory considered a devil. She looked at him. He was watching her, His face was a mask of sweat and dirt, but his eyes were clear, alert, and guarded. Clara took a deep breath. She smoothed her apron, a reflexive gesture of civilization in the face of chaos. "I am going to help you," she said, her voice shaking but loud enough to be heard over the rising wind outside. "But we must have rules." She walked to the small table where she kept her few valuables and picked up her revolver. She checked the cylinder, ensuring it was loaded, and then placed it on the mantel, within her reach but away from his. She turned back to him, meeting his gaze squarely. "I will clean that leg," she said. "I will give you water and food, but you do not touch me. You do not grab me. If you try, I will shoot you. Do you understand?" Sage looked at the gun, then at her hands, and finally at her eyes. He gave a single, imperceptible nod. It was not a gesture of submission, but of agreement, a treaty signed in silence. Clara let out a breath she did not know she was holding. Good. She moved into action. Fear was a luxury she could not afford, so she replaced it with work. She stoked the fire in the small stone hearth, feeding it kindling until the flames licked high. She filled her iron kettle with water from the bucket and hung it over the heat. "This will hurt," she said, gathering her supplies. She laid them out on the floor beside him, a clean strip of white cotton from her petticoat, a bottle of corn whiskey she kept for toothaches, a pair of pliers she used for fencing, and her sewing kit. Sage watched her preparations without expression. He reached down and tore the bloody rag from his leg. The wound was ugly. The rusted teeth of the bear trap had chewed through the leather legging and bitten deep into the muscle of his calf. The flesh was jagged, swollen, and dark with dried blood and rust. Clara felt her stomach turn, but she swallowed the bile. She uncorked the whiskey. "Drink," she commanded, holding the bottle out to him. Sage ignored the bottle. He reached for a piece of firewood, a small stick of hickory. He placed it between his teeth and bit down. He looked at her and nodded at the leg. He was refusing the dulling of his senses. He wanted to stay awake. He wanted to watch her. Clara hesitated, then poured a generous amount of the amber liquid directly into the wound. Sage's body went rigid. Every muscle in his neck stood out like corded steel. His hands gripped his thighs until the knuckles turned white. A sharp hiss of breath escaped through his clenched teeth, but he did not scream. "I have to get the rust out," Clara said, her voice sounding thin in the small room. "And I have to stitch it." She took her small paring knife, the blade of which she had held in the fire until it glowed dull red. She knelt beside him. The smell of singed hair and cauterized flesh filled the cabin, mixing with the scent of wood smoke and fear. For 20 minutes, the only sounds in the room were the crackle of the fire and the ragged breathing of the warrior. Clara worked with a focus that surprised her. Her hands, which had trembled when holding the gun, were steady now. She cleaned the debris from the tear. She threaded her needle with thick silk thread. She sewed the edges of the skin together, her movements precise and economic. When she tied the final knot and wrapped the clean bandage around his calf, she sat back, wiping sweat from her own forehead. Her dress was stained with his blood. Sage spat the piece of wood onto the floor. It was marked with deep indentations from his teeth. He looked at his leg, then at Clara. "Water," he rasped. It was the first word he had spoken. His voice was like grinding stones, rough and unused to her language. Clara fetched the tin cup and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, water spilling down his chin and washing away streaks of war paint and dust. "Thank you," he said. Clara pulled back, retreating to the safety of the other side of the room. "Rest now. If you have a fever, there is nothing more I can do." For 2 days, the cabin became a world unto itself. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the corners of the structure like a pack of wolves testing for weakness. Inside, a strange domesticity formed. It was not the domesticity of a family, but of 2 soldiers sharing a foxhole. Sage slept for long stretches, his body fighting the infection. When he was awake, he sat propped up against the wall, whittling a piece of cedar with a small knife he had produced from his belt. He did not speak much, but his eyes followed Clara as she moved. Clara found that she could not work outside with him in the cabin. She feared leaving him alone with her things, and she feared being seen entering and exiting, so she worked indoors. She sanded the rough spots on the walls. She mended her torn clothes, to fill the silence, and perhaps to remind herself that she was still civilized. She began to read aloud. She had only 3 books, a Bible, a heavy volume on agriculture, and a battered copy of Ivanhoe. She chose Ivanhoe. The sun was setting upon one of the rich grassy glades of that forest which we have mentioned in the beginning of the chapter, she read, sitting on a stool by the window, the gray light falling on the pages. Sage stopped whittling. He tilted his head, listening to the cadence of her voice. He did not understand all the words, she was sure, but he seemed to understand the rhythm. The story of knights and honor and battles seemed to resonate with him. Knights, he said suddenly during a pause. They are warriors. Clara looked up, surprised. Yes, warriors who fight for a king, and for honor. Sage grunted. Honor's good. Kings are bad. Clara almost smiled. I am inclined to agree with you. She poured him more broth from the pot. As she handed him the bowl, their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting contact, but it sent a jolt through her. It was not scary this time. It was a sudden, sharp awareness of him as a man. He was dangerous, yes, but there was a quiet dignity to him that Arthur and the men at the trading post lacked. He did not leer. He did not boast. He simply was. Why do you live alone? Sage asked, taking the bowl. Clara hesitated. Because I would rather belong to the wind than to a man who thinks he owns me. Sage nodded slowly. He looked at the feather he had left for her, which she had brought inside and placed on the mantel. The wind is a hard master, but it is fair. And you? Clara asked, emboldened. Why are you alone, your people? They travel in bands, do they not? Sage's face darkened. The openness vanished, replaced by the stoic mask. There are too many fences now, he said cryptically. I watch the fences. He did not elaborate, and Clara did not push. They ate in silence, the storm outside growing louder. The next morning, the supplies ran low. The coffee was gone, and Clara had used the last of her thread on Sage's leg. I have to go to the trading post, she announced, putting on her heavy cloak. Sage tried to stand, wincing as weight hit his bad leg. No, dangerous. Crow is there. I cannot starve, Clara said, tying her bonnet. And if I do not show my face, they will wonder why. They will come looking. She was right, and they both knew it. Sage sank back down, frustration evident in the set of his jaw. Watch the ridge. Do not ride in the open. Clara took the wagon, pushing Barnaby hard. She reached the trading post by midday. The wind was whipping up dust devils in the yard, blinding and gritty. The post was quiet. A few horses were tethered at the rail, their heads down against the wind. Clara hurried inside. Martha Briggs was behind the counter, measuring out flour for a young boy. When she saw Clara, her eyes widened. She finished with the boy quickly, shooing him out the door. You, Martha hissed, waving Clara over. I thought you had run off, or died. Not yet, Clara said, keeping her voice low. I need a thread, and coffee, and do you have any willow bark? Martha paused, her hand hovering over the jar of peppermint sticks. She looked at Clara sharply. Willow bark, that is for fever and pain. You hurt, girl. Just a headache. Clara lied poorly. Martha leaned over the counter. Listen to me. Crow was here this morning. Him and that snake Pike. They are stirring up the boys, telling them there is a Comanche raiding party hiding in the creek beds, saying they found cattle slaughtered. It is a lie, Clara said. Does not matter if it is a lie. Martha snapped. Truth does not load a gun. Fear does. They are getting a posse together. A cleanup crew, they call it. They are going to sweep the valley, burn out the brush. Clara felt a cold knot in her stomach. When? Soon. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe tonight if the wind dies down. Martha reached under the counter. She pulled out a small packet of needles and a bundle of dried bark. She slid them across the wood, along with a small pouch of tobacco. "Take it," Martha said, "and take this advice. If you see dust, you run. Don't be a hero. A cabin can be rebuilt. A grave cannot." Clara took the supplies. "Why are you helping me?" "Martha." The older woman looked at the door, then back at Clara. Her hard face softened for a fraction of a second. "Because my husband was a man like Crow, and because these men, they do not fear the Comanche half as much as they fear a woman who does not need them to survive. Now go." Clara paid with her dwindling coins and fled. She rode back with the wind at her back, the sky turning a bruised purple in the north. The temperature was dropping fast. A blue norther was coming, one of those sudden, violent Texas storms that could freeze a man in his saddle. She reached the cabin just as the first gusts hit. The canvas roof she had temporarily rigged over the unfinished section of the loft flapped violently, sounding like gunshots. She burst through the door. Sage was standing, balancing on his good leg, his knife in hand. He lowered it when he saw her. "Storm," he said. "I know," Clara said, tossing the supplies on the table. "And Crow is coming. Maybe not tonight, but soon." Sage ignored the news of Crow. He was looking up at the roof. The main beam, the one she had struggled to place, was groaning. The wind was hitting the cabin broadside, and the structure, still settling, was shifting. "The roof," Sage said. "It will not hold." Clara looked up. The heavy ridgepole was vibrating. If it slipped, the whole roof would collapse inward. "We have to brace it," she said. She grabbed a spare timber, a 4x4 post she had cut for the porch. "Help me." Sage hobbled forward. The pain must have been excruciating, but he did not hesitate. They positioned the post under the center of the groaning beam. "On 3!" Clara shouted over the roar of the wind. "1, 2, 3!" They pushed. Clara shoved with her shoulders, her boots sliding on the floorboards. Sage pushed with his arms and his back, taking the weight off his injured leg. The beam lifted an inch. Clara kicked a wedge of wood under the post to lock it in place. But the wind was not done. A gust of tremendous force slammed into the north wall. The cabin shuddered. The crossbeam above the door began to twist. "It needs a nail!" Clara screamed. "The joint is slipping!" She grabbed her hammer and a long iron spike. She dragged a crate over to the door. "Hold it steady." Sage moved to the wall. He reached up, his tall frame allowing him to grip the crossbeam. He clamped his hands around the wood, using his weight to pull it back into alignment. His muscles trembled with the effort. Blood seeped through the bandage on his leg, staining the fabric dark red. Clara climbed onto the crate. She was face to face with him now, elevated by the box. She could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. She could smell the scent of pine and sweat and rain on his skin. She placed the spike. She swung the hammer. Clang, clang, clang. The iron bit deep into the oak. She drove it home, locking the joint. Sage let out a breath and slumped against the wall, but he did not let go. The cabin groaned one last time, then settled. The brace was held. The nail held. They stood there for a long moment, the storm raging outside, isolated in their small, fragile box of light. Clara was breathing hard, her chest heaving. Sage was looking at her, his expression intense. They were less than a foot apart. The rules Clara had set seemed to blur in the adrenaline of survival. This was an alliance of necessity, forged in sweat and iron. "You are strong," Sage said softly. It was not a compliment. It was an observation of fact. "I have to be," Clara replied. She climbed down from the crate. Her legs felt weak. She went to the table and opened the packet of willow bark. She brewed a tea, her hands steady again. They drank the bitter tea in silence as the temperature plummeted outside. Frost began to form on the inside of the single glass window pane. Later that night, the wind died down to a low moan. The cabin had survived. Sage took the piece of cedar he had been whittling. He stood up and limped over to the crossbeam Clara had nailed, the one they had saved together. With his knife, He reached up, beside the iron head of the nail. He carved a small symbol into the wood. It was not a feather this time. It was a simple shape, a circle with a line through it, bisecting the horizon. "What is that?" Clara asked, watching him from the hearth. "An anchor," Sage said, though the word he used in his tongue meant something closer to root or center. "It says that this wood remembers. It will not break." He looked at her. "And it says that you are not just a guest on this land. You have bled into it." Clara touched her own hand, where the old cut from the rope still lingered. She looked at the blood on his bandage. "We both have," she said. The peace lasted until dawn. The sun broke over the horizon, cold and sharp, illuminating a world scoured clean by the wind. But the silence was broken not by birds, but by the heavy, rhythmic thumping of horses, many horses. Sage was instantly alert. He moved to the window, keeping his body pressed against the wall to avoid being seen. He peered through the crack in the shutter. He turned to Clara, his face grim. "Riders," he said. 10 men, maybe more." Clara rushed to the door and looked through the peephole. Coming up the trail from the creek was a column of men. They wore long coats and carried rifles. Leading them was Harlan Pike, looking hungover and mean. Beside him rode Silas Crow on his black mare. They were not sneaking. They were riding in formation. This was not an ambush. It was an execution disguised as an inspection. "The Vigilance Committee?" Clara whispered. She turned to Sage. Panic flared in her chest, hot and bright. "You cannot be here. If they find you—" "I cannot run," Sage said calmly. "My leg." He was right. He could not outrun a horse, not with that wound. And the trees were too far across open ground. "Hide," Clara said, her eyes darting around the small room. "The loft. It is not finished, but there are crates." "They will search," Sage said. "They are looking for rats. They will look in the holes. Then we make them look at something else," Clara said. Her mind was racing, fueled by the same desperation that had made her drive a nail into a twisting beam. She grabbed the ledger she had hidden in the wall back in Part 2. She hesitated, then shoved it under the mattress of her cot. It was a flimsy hiding place. But she had no time. "Get behind the door," she hissed. "If they come in, you do what you must, but let me talk first." Sage looked at her. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw the resolve. She was placing herself between him and the wolves. He moved into the deep shadow behind the heavy oak door, pressing himself flat against the timbers, his knife in his hand. Clara smoothed her hair. She pinched her cheeks to bring color to her pale face. She unbolted the door. She stepped out onto the porch, closing the door behind her but leaving it unlatched. She stood there, a small figure in a stained dress, holding an empty bucket as if she were merely starting her chores. The riders fanned out in a semicircle around the cabin. They blocked the sun. Silas Crow pulled his horse up. He smiled, but his eyes were scanning the perimeter, looking for tracks. "Good morning, Miss Whitmore," Crow called out. "I trust you weathered the storm." "The cabin held," Clara said, her voice steady. "What brings the committee out so early, Mr. Crow?" "We had reports," Pike spoke up, spitting into the dirt. "Tracks, blood. Someone saw a crippled animal crawling near your creek. Or maybe a crippled savage." Crow nodded. "We are here to help. Clara, we need to search the premises. For your safety. Of course, we cannot have a wounded Comanche hiding in a lady's boudoir. Can we?" Clara gripped the handle of the bucket until her knuckles turned white. "I have seen no one," she said. "And you have no right to enter my home." Crow's smile vanished. "This is not a request. My dear, it is a sweep." He gestured to Pike and 2 other men. "Check the barn, check the wagon, and check under the bed." Pike swung down from his horse. He walked toward the porch, the spurs on his boots jingling like a death knell. He looked at Clara, and then he looked at the door behind her. "Step aside, girl," Pike growled. Clara did not move. Behind the wood of the door, she knew Sage was tensing, his muscles coiling for a fight he could not win. I said. Pike reached for his holster. Step aside. Clara took a breath. The storm had passed, but the real thunder was just beginning. Clara stood her ground on the porch, but Harlan Pike was a man who moved like a mudslide, heavy, inevitable, and dirty. He did not wait for her to step aside. He simply walked forward, his shoulder checking hers with enough force to send her stumbling back against the door frame. Check the pantry, Pike barked to the two men behind him. He stepped into the main room of the cabin, his spurs raking across the floorboards Clara had scrubbed on her hands and knees. Clara regained her balance and rushed inside. You have no warrant, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and terror. This is trespassing. Pike ignored her. He looked around the room with a sneer that barely concealed his greed. His eyes lingered on the solid oak table, the cast-iron stove, and the simple but well-made curtains Clara had sewn. He was not looking for a fugitive. He was appraising an inheritance. Cozy, Pike muttered. He walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the small china shepherdess that had belonged to Clara's mother. He turned it over in his grimy hands, then dropped it. It shattered on the hearthstone. Oops, Pike said, not looking down. He turned his gaze to the back of the room, where the sleeping area was partitioned off by a flimsy curtain. What is behind the curtain? Missy. Clara's heart stopped. The ledger was under the mattress. The loose board in the wall was behind the flour barrel in that corner. My private things, Clara said, stepping between him and the curtain. Have you no decency? Decency is for Sundays. Pike grinned, revealing yellow teeth. He took a step toward her, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Now move, or I will move you. The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with violence. Clara's hand hovered near her own waist, but she knew she could not draw fast enough. Then, the shadows in the corner shifted. Do not touch her! The voice was low, resonant, and calm. It did not sound like a threat. It sounded like a fact. Pike spun around, his gun half drawn. The two other men froze near the pantry. Sage stepped out from the darkness behind the heavy oak door. He was not crouching. He was not hiding. He stood at his full height, his back straight, his chin lifted. He wore no war paint, only his buckskins and the bandage on his leg. He held no weapon in his hands. His knife was sheathed at his belt, his hands open at his sides. For a long second, the only sound was the wind whistling through the chinking. The men stared. They had expected a monster, a skulking creature of the brush. Instead, they were faced with a man who possessed a quiet nobility that shamed their own ragged appearances. Well, Pike whispered, recovering his wits. He leveled his gun at Sage's chest. Look what we have here. The rat comes out of the wall. Sage did not flinch. He looked past Pike, his eyes locking onto Silas Crow, who had just dismounted and was standing in the doorway. I am no rat, Sage said, his English broken but clear. I am the watcher of this land. Crow clapped his gloved hands together slowly. The sound was dry and mocking. A watcher. How poetic. And what exactly are you watching? Savage our horses, our cattle. Crow stepped into the room, filling the space with his expensive cologne and his overwhelming menace. He looked at the other men, who were wavering, unsure whether to shoot or wait. You see, boys, Crow said, his voice smooth as oil. We were right. The thefts, the fires. It was not bad luck. It was him. He gestured at Sage. He worms his way in, seduces a lonely woman, and uses her cabin as a base to terrorize decent, God-fearing folk. That is a lie, Clara shouted. He saved my life. He is hurt because of your traps. Hush, child, Crow snapped, his eyes flashing. You are bewildered, or perhaps you are complicit. Either way, your testimony is tainted. Crow turned to the men outside. We have the horse thief. We have the raider. A murmur went through the group. They needed this. They needed a face to put on their fears. It was easier to hate a man standing in front of them than to hate the empty, howling wilderness. Pike cocked the hammer of his revolver. Let me finish him, boss. Right here. No, Crow said sharply. The room went silent. Not here, Crow said, looking at Clara. We do not slaughter men in a lady's parlor. It is untidy. And besides, he smiled, a cold, reptilian expression. We need to make sure the lesson sticks. We need the whole town to see. He turned to his men. Secure the perimeter. No one goes in, no one comes out. We will decide how to handle this filth when the sun goes down. As the men shuffled out to take up positions, a heavy-set woman in a gray bonnet pushed past them into the cabin. It was Martha Briggs. She carried a basket covered with a checkered cloth. Out of my way, you fools, Martha grumbled, shouldering Pike aside. If you are going to hold a siege, the girl needs water. I will not have her dying of thirst in my conscience. Make it quick, Martha, Crow warned. And do not try anything foolish. Martha bustled over to the table, placing the basket down with a heavy thud. She turned to Clara, her broad back blocking Crow's view. You are a stubborn fool. Clara Whitmore, Martha scolded loudly, grabbing Clara's hands as if to check for injuries. But as her rough hands squeezed Clara's, Clara felt something sharp, a piece of paper. Take it, Martha whispered, her lips barely moving. Then, in her loud voice, drink some water. Pray for your soul. She pulled away, leaving the scrap of paper in Clara's palm. Clara clenched her fist, hiding it in the folds of her skirt. Martha turned to Sage. She looked him up and down, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. Once. You have good eyes. Warrior, keep them open. She marched out, brushing past Crow. I am leaving. I have a business to run. Do not expect me to dig the graves. Crow watched her go, then turned back to the couple. Enjoy your afternoon, he said. Think about your choices. Miss Whitmore, it is not too late to sell the deed. Perhaps leniency could be arranged. He stepped out and pulled the heavy door shut. Clara heard the sound of a heavy log being dragged against the outside of the door. Wedging it shut, they were trapped. Clara rushed to the window. Men were stationed at every corner of the clearing, rifles resting in the crooks of their arms. She unfolded the paper Martha had given her. It was a torn corner of a sugar sack, written on with charcoal. They do not plan to arrest him. Crow bought 2 barrels of kerosene. He waits for dark to burn the evidence. And you... Clara let out a shaky breath. She handed the note to Sage. He looked at the symbols he could not read, then at her face. Fire, he asked. Fire, Clara confirmed. Tonight. She sank down onto the bench, the adrenaline draining away to leave a hollow exhaustion. I'm sorry, she whispered. I brought this on you. If I had not... Stop, Sage said. He moved to her, his limp pronounced but his movement steady. He sat on the floor beside her bench, looking up at her. I chose to come, he said. I chose to stay. Clara looked down at him. The barriers of race and culture, of propriety and fear, seemed to dissolve in the dim light of the condemned cabin. Why? She asked. Why me? I am nothing, just a woman running away from debt. Sage reached out and touched the hem of her skirt. I grew up on the plains, he said quietly. No fences. Then the white men came. They put up wire. They put up walls. Everywhere I looked, I saw a cage. He looked into her eyes. When I saw you building, I saw someone who hated cages too, but you were building one. It made me curious. And now, Clara asked, now we are in a cage together. Now, Sage said, I see that the cage is not the wood. It is the fear. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. I have been afraid my whole life. Afraid of my stepfather, afraid of hunger, afraid of being sold like a heifer at an auction. I thought if I built this place, I would be safe. I will be strong. You are strong, Sage said. He reached up and took her hand. His skin was rough, calloused from the bow and the rain, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He turned her hand over, tracing the lines of her palm with his thumb. Clara, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange and beautiful on his tongue. He looked at her, a silent question in his dark eyes. He did not pull her. He did not demand. He waited. Clara looked at his mouth, then his eyes. She felt the warmth of his hand seeping into hers, grounding her. For the first time in 22 years, she did not feel like a piece of property. She felt like a partner. "Permission?" he asked softly. Clara nodded. "Yes." He rose to his knees, wincing slightly, bringing his face level with hers. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When his lips touched hers, it was not the devouring kiss of a romance novel. It was the meeting of two tired souls finding rest. It tasted of dust and coffee and danger. It was soft, hesitant, and then, as she leaned into him, firm and desperate, Clara's hands found his shoulders, gripping the buckskin. She felt the beat of his heart against her chest. In that kiss, the fear of the fire outside receded, replaced by a different kind of heat, one that affirmed life rather than threatening it. They broke apart slowly. Sage rested his forehead against hers. "I will get you out," he promised. "We will get out," Clara corrected. Together. A soft tap on the back shutter made them both jump. Sage had his knife in his hand in a blink. He motioned for Clara to stay back. He crept to the small window on the north wall, the one facing the thickest part of the woods. The tap came again. 3 light knocks. Sage peered through the crack. He unlatched the shutter carefully. A face appeared in the gaped dark skin, wide eyes, and a sweat-stained hat. It was Elias Knox, the cowhand from the trading post. "Quiet," Elias hissed. "They are watching the front." "Elias," Clara whispered, creeping forward. "What are you doing?" "Saving my own soul, I reckon," Elias muttered. He passed a small flask through the window. "Water and news." "Crow has the deputy in his pocket," Elias said quickly. "I heard them talking. The deputy signed a paper saying you were killed by Indians. It is already done. You are dead on paper. Miss Clara." "The ledger," Clara said. "It proves Crow is stealing land. Does not matter if you burn it," Elias said. "Listen, the creek bed to the south. It is dry. If you can get to the willows. There is a horse tied there. Only one. My horse. One horse," Sage repeated. He looked at Clara. "You take her," Elias said to Sage. "You get her to Fort Belknap. The colonel there hates Crow. He will listen." "Elias, come with us," Clara pleaded. "Cannot," Elias shook his head. "If I am missing, they will know. I have to go back to the line. But listen, when the sun hits the tree line, Crow is going to light the arrows. He wants it to look like a raid. You have maybe 1 hour." "Thank you, Elias," Clara said, gripping his hand through the window. "Run fast, little bird," Elias said. And then he was gone, melting back into the brush. Clara turned to Sage. "One horse. You ride," Sage said immediately. "I will hold them." "No," Clara said firmly. "We ride together, or we walk together. Barnaby can carry us part of the way." "The mule is slow," Sage argued. "The mule is strong," Clara countered. "And so am I." Sage looked at her, frustration warring with admiration in his eyes. He knew she was right. Splitting up meant death for the one left behind. "We prepare," Sage said. They moved with frantic efficiency. They could not take everything. The quilt her grandmother made, the china that was already broken, the books. It all had to stay. Clara went to the wall behind the flour barrel. She pried the board loose again and retrieved the ledger. She wrapped it in oilskin and tied it around her waist, under her apron. "This is the shield," she said. Sage checked his weapons. He had his knife, his bow, and 3 arrows remaining in his quiver. And Clara's revolver. He handed the gun to her. "You shoot. I am not a killer," Clara said, her voice trembling. "Tonight," Sage said grimly. "We are all killers, or we are ghosts." The light in the cabin began to change. The golden hue of late afternoon was fading into the gray of twilight. The wind had died down completely, leaving a terrifying stillness. Clara looked around the cabin one last time. The unfinished walls, the roof they had braced together, the mark of the anchor Sage had carved into the beam. It was just wood. That was what she told herself. It was just wood and mud, but it felt like tearing a piece of her heart out. "It will burn," she whispered. "We will build another," Sage said. He was standing by the back door, the one that led to the small animal pen. It was barred from the outside, but the wood was thinner there. Then, the smell hit them. It was sharp, chemical, and pungent. It seeped under the door and through the cracks in the logs. Kerosene. Someone was splashing it onto the front porch. "It begins," Sage said. "Hey in there!" Crow's voice boomed, distorted by the timber walls. "I hope you have made your peace. The Comanche are attacking. Such a tragedy." A roar of laughter from the men. Then, a whoosh sound. A flare of orange light flickered through the front window. The heat was instantaneous. The dry wood of the porch caught like tinder. Smoke began to curl under the doorframe, black and choking. "Now," Sage said. He did not go for the door. He went to the floor. "The root cellar," he commanded. Clara stared at him. "We will bake." "No," Sage said. "The tunnel, the drainage ditch you dug. It goes under the wall." Clara remembered. She had dug a trench to drain water away from the foundation on the south side. It was shallow, muddy, and narrow, covered only by loose planks on the porch she hadn't finished. Sage kicked the rug aside. He pried up 2 floorboards with the leverage of his axe handle. Below was the damp, dark land. "Go," Sage said. "I follow." The front wall was crackling now. The sound of the fire was like a living beast, devouring the labor of her hands. The temperature in the room spiked. Clara lowered herself into the hole. The mud was cold against her legs. She crawled forward, squeezing her body into the narrow space between the floor joists and the dirt. Sage dropped in behind her. He pulled the floorboards back into place above them, plunging them into darkness just as the front windows shattered from the heat. Above them, the fire roared. Below, in the mud, they crawled toward the edge of the light, hand in hand, while the world above them turned to ash. The heat beneath the floorboards was a physical weight, pressing down on them through the damp earth. Above, the sound of the fire was not a crackle, but a roar, a voracious beast devouring the dry timber of the home Clara had bled to build. Smoke, thick and acrid, curled through the gaps in the floor, stinging their eyes and filling their throats with the taste of ash. Clara crawled on her elbows, the mud slick and cold against her stomach, a jarring contrast to the inferno raging inches above her head. Sage was right behind her, his hand gripping her ankle, a silent signal that he was still there, still conscious despite the agony his injured leg must have been causing him. They reached the end of the drainage ditch. It opened out under the unfinished section of the porch, where the lattice work was sparse. Clara kicked the flimsy wood away. They burst out into the night, coughing and gasping. The cool air felt like a blessing, but it was short-lived. They were not safe. They had merely traded a coffin of fire for a killing field. The cabin was a torch. The flames licked up the walls, turning the night sky a bruised orange. The heat was so intense it pushed the air away in shimmering waves. "There!" a voice shouted. A gunshot cracked, the bullet kicking up dirt inches from Clara's hand. Sage moved before Clara could even register the threat. He did not rise to his full height. He stayed low, a shadow detaching itself from the darkness. He launched himself at the nearest Vigilance Committee member, a man named Miller who had been tasked with watching the rear. Sage struck him with the shoulder, knocking the wind out of him. The rifle flew from Miller's hands. Sage did not kill him. He did not have the time. He drove a fist into the man's jaw, silencing him, and rolled back toward Clara. "The water trough," Sage hissed, pointing to the large oak barrel near the corner of the house. Clara understood. They needed cover. The smoke was their only shield, but the wind was clearing it too fast. Clara scrambled toward the barrel. She did not hide behind it. She shoved it with all her strength. The barrel tipped. 50 gallons of water cascaded onto the burning corner of the porch. The reaction was explosive. The water hit the superheated wood and instantly vaporized. A massive cloud of white steam billowed out, thick and blinding. mixing with the black smoke to create a wall of gray fog. "Move," Sage commanded. They ran, or rather, Clara ran and Sage limped with a terrifying speed, using the steam as a veil. They made it to the stack of unhewn logs, the very ones Sage had moved for her nights ago. From the center of the yard, Silas Crow sat on his horse, his face twisted in a rictus of rage. The firelight danced in his eyes, making him look demonic. "Find them!" Crow screamed, pointing his riding crop at the steam cloud. "They are rats! Burn them out!" Harlan Pike strode forward, his pistol drawn. He was enjoying this. He fired blindly into the smoke. Clara crouched behind the logs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt the heavy weight of the ledger tied around her waist. It was not just paper. It was the truth. She looked at the cabin, the roof. The roof she and Sage had braced together during the storm was groaning. The fire had eaten through the supports. And in that moment, the memory hit her with the force of a physical blow. She remembered the first day, standing alone in the mud, thinking she could build a fortress against the world. She had thought freedom meant needing no one. She looked at Sage. He was checking his bow, his face set in grim determination. He was bleeding from his leg, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, ready to die to protect her. She was not alone, and she would not let him die for a lie. "Sage," Clara whispered. "Cover me." "No," Sage said, grabbing her arm. "Too dangerous." "They think we are scared," Clara said, her voice finding a steel she did not know she possessed. "They think we are running. We have to change the story." She pulled her arm free. She did not run away. She stood up. She stood up behind the log pile, the fire framing her silhouette against the night. She raised her revolver, not to shoot, but to be seen. "Crow!" she screamed, the sound of her voice, shrill and furious, cut through the roar of the fire. Silas Crow turned his horse. Pike stopped his advance. They stared at the woman who was supposed to be cowering in a hole. "You missed!" Clara shouted. "You stupid girl!" Crow laughed, though the sound was uneasy. "Come out, Clara, give me the book, and maybe I will let you live. I will even let you keep your savage pet." "This book," Clara patted her waist. "The book that says you paid Deputy Reynolds $200 to ignore the arson. The book that says you hired men to dress as Comanche and slaughter the Miller family's cattle." The silence that fell over the clearing was absolute. The men of the Vigilance Committee, men who were farmers, fathers, neighbors, lowered their rifles slightly. They looked at each other. They hated Indians. Yes, but they hated horse thieves and liars more. "She lies!" Crow roared, his composure cracking. "She is hysterical, killer! It is all here!" Clara yelled, her voice carrying to the men on the perimeter. "The dates, the payments. He is not protecting you. He is scaring you, so you will sell your land for pennies. He is starting a war to make himself a king." "Shut her up!" "Pike!" Crow shrieked. Pike raised his pistol. He did not hesitate. He was a man who enjoyed violence too much to care about politics. Sage saw the hammer fall. He did not have an arrow nocked. He had used his last moments to prepare the escape. He had only one option. He threw himself in front of Clara, but Clara was moving too. She saw Pike's eyes. She knew the look of a predator. She tried to push Sage aside. Crack! The sound was flat and final. Clara felt a blow like a sledgehammer hit her left shoulder. It spun her around. The world tilted on its axis. She hit the dirt, the breath driven from her lungs. For a second, there was no pain, only a cold numbness spreading down her arm. Then, the fire in her nerves woke up, screaming. "Clara!" Sage's voice was a raw tear in the fabric of the night. The warrior vanished. In his place was a storm. Sage did not look at Pike. He moved. He snatched a burning brand from the log pile, a piece of timber that had rolled off the porch. He hurled it with a guttural roar. The flaming wood struck Pike full in the chest. The gunman screamed as his duster coat, soaked in oil and sweat, caught a spark. He flailed, dropping his gun, beating at the flames. Sage was on him in 2 strides. He kicked Pike's legs out from under him. The big man hit the ground hard. Sage stood over him, his knife drawn, ready to end the life of the man who had hurt his woman. "Do it!" Crow shouted from his horse. trying to rally his confused men. "Kill the savage!" Sage looked up. He saw Crow. The man was 30 yards away, sitting high in his saddle, exposed. Sage had the knife. He could throw it. He had never missed at this range. He could put the blade right in Crow's throat and end the rot that was poisoning the valley. But then he heard a sound. A small, ragged gasp. "Sage!" He looked back. Clara was trying to sit up. Her hand was pressed to her shoulder. Blood was dark and glossy between her fingers, dripping onto the ledger she still clutched with her other hand. If he killed Crow, the rest of the men would panic. They would open fire. They would kill Clara. If he saved Clara, Crow would live. It was not a choice. It was a reflex. Sage sheathed his knife. He turned his back on the enemy, the ultimate act of dismissal. He ran to Clara. He scooped her up in his arms. She was light, too light. Her head lolled against his chest. "Stay with me," he commanded, his voice fierce. "You built the house. You stay to live in it." "The house is gone," Clara whispered, her eyes fluttering toward the inferno. The cabin collapsed. The roof finally gave way, sending a fountain of sparks into the sky. The walls folded in on themselves. But as the structure fell, a single beam, the heavy crossbeam over the door, the one with the iron nail and the carving of the anchor, tumbled free. It landed in the dirt, scorched but unbroken. Clara reached out. Her fingers brushed the hot wood. "Take it," she gasped. Sage did not argue. He shifted her weight to one arm, straining his own injured leg to the breaking point. With his free hand, he grabbed the end of the beam. It was heavy, impossibly heavy for one man to drag while carrying a woman. But he found the strength in a place deeper than muscle. He dragged the wood. He carried the woman. He moved toward the dark tree line. Crow leveled his own pistol. "I will do it myself." He aimed at Sage's retreating back. "Mr. Crow." The voice came from the trail. It was booming, authoritative, and angry. Silas Crow froze. He turned his head. Riding into the clearing was not the cavalry, but something worse for a man like him. It was a wagon. And sitting on the wagon seat was Martha Briggs, holding a double-barreled shotgun. Walking beside the wagon, armed with a repeating rifle, was Elias Knox. And behind them were 4 other men ranchers from the southern ridge, men Crow had not yet bought. "Drop it, Silas," Martha yelled. "Unless you want to explain to these gentlemen why you are shooting a woman." "She is a traitor," Crow shouted, though his hand wavered. "She is harboring a fugitive. We saw the fire." "Silas," Elias called out, stepping into the light. "We saw you light it. And I have the station master here who says you bought the kerosene yesterday. Said it was for cleaning." The Vigilance Committee members lowered their guns completely. They looked at the burning cabin. They looked at the woman bleeding in the arms of the Comanche warrior. And they looked at the fat, rich man on the horse who had promised them safety. "I am done," one of the men said, spitting on the ground. "I did not sign up for this." "Me neither," another said. Crow's face turned purple. "You cowards! You are letting them get away." "He is a Comanche. He is carrying her," Martha said, her voice cutting through the noise. "You are the one holding the gun." Crow looked around. He saw the tide turning. He saw the disgust in the eyes of the men he thought he owned. He realized, with a jolt of cold terror, that his power was not money. It was fear, and the fear had just changed direction. He holstered his gun. He looked at Sage and Clara, who had reached the edge of the trees. "Run, you dogs!" Crow spat. "Run! The wilderness will kill you anyway." Sage did not look back. He did not care about Crow. Crow was a ghost of the past. Clara was the future. He plunged into the trees, the darkness welcoming them like a mother. They moved fast, fueled by adrenaline and terror. Sage ignored the screaming pain in his leg. He carried Clara through the brush, shielding her face from the whipping branches. He dragged the piece of scorched timber behind him, a plow cutting a furrow in the earth. They reached the creek bed where Elias had promised the horse. The animal was there, a sturdy roan mare tied to a willow branch. She whinnied nervously at the smell of smoke. But she held fast. Sage lifted Clara onto the saddle. She cried out as her shoulder moved, a sharp, keen sound that made Sage's heart clench. "Bind it," Sage said. He ripped a strip from his own shirt. Clara shook her head, her teeth gritted. "Ride, just ride. Bind it later." Sage mounted behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, careful of the wound, pulling her back against his chest. He could feel her blood soaking into his buckskins, warm and terrifying. "Hold the wood," Sage said. He passed the end of the scorched beam up to her. It was awkward, heavy, and ridiculous to carry a piece of a burnt house while fleeing for your life. But Clara gripped it with her good hand. She held it across the saddle pommel like a holy relic. Sage kicked the horse. They surged forward, splashing through the shallow creek, heading up the embankment and toward the high passes. Behind them, the glow of the fire faded, but the smoke still stained the stars. They rode in silence for a long time. The rhythm of the horse was a jarring agony for Clara, but she focused on the breathing of the man behind her. In, out, in, out. It was the only clock that mattered, as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, painting the limestone cliffs in shades of rose and slate. They reached the crest of the valley. Sage pulled the horse to a halt. He looked back. From this height, the cabin was just a smudge of black on the green earth. A scar. Clara leaned her head back against his shoulder. Her face was pale, her lips blue from shock and blood loss. "It is gone," she whispered. Sage tightened his arm around her. "No," he said. He reached forward and placed his hand over hers, the one clutching the charred wood with the anchor symbol. "The wood is here," Sage said. "The fire took the walls. It did not take me home." Clara looked down at the beam. The carving was black with soot, but the deep cuts of the knife were still visible. The anchor, the root. She looked at the vast, open country ahead of them. It was wild. It was dangerous. It was full of wolves and weather and men like Crow. But for the first time, the horizon did not look like a threat. It looked like a canvas. "Where do we go?" Clara asked. Her voice was weak, but the question was not fearful. Sage turned the horse's head toward the west, where the mountains rose purple and majestic against the morning. "We go where the fences end," Sage said. He urged the horse forward, descending into the canyon, leaving the smoke and the lies behind them. They were wounded. They were hunted. They had nothing but a horse, a gun, a ledger, and a piece of burnt wood. But as the sun crested the peaks, bathing them in golden light, Clara Whitmore realized she was richer than Silas Crow would ever be. She closed her eyes and let the warrior take her home. The canyon offered a brutal kind of sanctuary. It was a gash in the earth, shadowed by limestone walls that wept moisture and shielded them from the biting wind of the high plains. They had stopped near a spring that trickled from the rock face, a small oasis of life in the barren stone. Sage lifted Clara from the saddle. Her body was alarming in its heat. The fever was setting in fast, racing the infection from the bullet graze. She made a small, sharp sound when her feet touched the ground, her knees buckling. Sage caught her, his arm a band of iron around her waist, taking her weight entirely. "Down," he murmured. "Rest now." He laid her on a bed of dry moss and gathered leaves he had hastily arranged beneath the overhang of the cliff. It was not a bed. It was barely a nest, but it was out of the wind. Clara clutched the charred piece of timber, the anchor beam, against her chest as if it were a child. Her other hand, sticky with drying blood, finally released its grip on the front of her dress. "The book," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Is it safe?" "The book is paper," Sage said, his voice tight. "You are blood. Blood matters more." He moved with a focused, terrifying intensity. He built a small fire, not for warmth, but for work. He used smokeless wood, dried driftwood from the creek bed that burned hot and clean. He filled his small tin cup with water from the spring and set it on the stones near the flames. He knelt beside her. He had to cut the dress. It was the only dress she owned, the blue calico she had worn when she arrived in the valley. now stained brown and black. He took his knife, the blade sharp enough to shave with, and sliced the fabric at the shoulder. Clara flinched, turning her head away. The exposure felt like another violation, another layer of her defenses stripped away by the violence of men like Pike and Crow. "Look at me," Sage commanded softly. Clara turned her eyes to him. His face was inches from hers. There was no pity in his dark eyes, only a fierce, steady competence. "I am going to hurt you," he said. "To clean it. You will not scream. Sound carries." Clara nodded. She bit her lip until it turned white. "Do it." Sage worked. He washed the wound with the boiled water, using a piece of clean cloth torn from the hem of her petticoat. The bullet had furrowed the flesh of her shoulder, deep enough to tear muscle but missing the bone. It was an ugly, angry trough of red meat, blackened at the edges by the powder burn. He took a pouch from his belt. Inside was a paste he had made days ago for his own leg yarrow, sage, and fat. He packed the wound with it. Clara arched her back, a silent gasp tearing from her throat. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes, hot and fast, tracking through the soot on her cheeks. She did not scream. She stared up at the stone ceiling of the overhang, focusing on a single spiderweb trembling in the draft, willing herself to be as still as the rock. When it was done, Sage bound the shoulder tight. He sat back on his heels, wiping his bloody hands on the grass. He looked exhausted. His own leg, the one chewed by the bear trap, was trembling with the strain of the ride and the carry. "Drink," he said, holding the cup to her lips. Clara drank. Then she looked at the piece of burnt wood lying next to her. The anchor symbol Sage had carved was filled with ash. The reality of it hit her then. The cabin, the garden she had turned, the curtains she had sewn, the silence she had bought with her labor. It was all gone. A pile of charcoal in a valley owned by a monster. A sob broke loose. It was not a polite cry. It was a jagged, ugly sound of grief. "I have nothing," she choked out. "I did everything right. I worked. I paid. I minded my business. And I have nothing." Sage watched her. He did not hush her. He moved closer, sitting beside her so their shoulders touched. "You have breath," Sage said. "You have the sun when it rises. It is not enough." Clara wept. "I wanted a home. I wanted to be free. But freedom is just running. It is just being cold and hunted." Sage looked out at the darkness beyond the firelight. "I used to watch you," he said quietly. "From the trees. When you were dragging the logs." Clara sniffed, wiping her eyes. "I know. You left the feather." "I watched you," Sage continued. "And I thought you were a spirit, a dream. In my culture, we have stories of women who come from the stars to test the warriors. You were so bright, alone in the gray land." He turned to look at her. "I thought, if I touch her, she will vanish. If I help her, she will break. I wanted you to be mine, but I thought mine meant safe in a memory." He reached out and touched her uninjured cheek. His thumb brushed away a tear. "But fire is the test of real things," he said. "Dreams burn up. You did not burn up. You are real, Clara. You are flesh and blood and pain, and that makes you more than a dream." Clara leaned into his hand. "I am just a woman who lost a house." "You are a woman who saved a warrior," Sage corrected. "And the house was just wood. The home is where you stand." A twig snapped in the darkness. Sage's hand dropped to his knife instantly. He twisted his body, putting himself between Clara and the sound. "Easy, friend," a voice whispered from the brush. "It is just me and a very tired horse." Elias Knox stepped into the circle of firelight. He looked like he had been dragged through a briar patch. His clothes were torn, and his face was scratched, but his eyes were bright with adrenaline. "Elias," Clara breathed. "How did you find us?" "I know this canyon," Elias said, crouching down. "And Sage leaves a trail a blind man could follow if he knew what to look for. You are dragging a tree beam, for God's sake." He looked at Clara's bandage. "Bad." "She will live," Sage said. Elias nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out a flask of whiskey. He took a swig and handed it to Sage. "The valley is a hornet's nest," Elias reported. "Crow is spinning a tale. Says you two kidnapped him and burned the cabin to cover your tracks. He has half the Vigilance Committee believing him. The other half, well, they are wondering why a kidnapper would save his own victim from a fire." "The ledger," Clara said. She fumbled at her waist with her good hand, untying the oilskin packet. She handed the book to Elias. "Take it." Elias took the book. He opened it. The edges were singed, and the cover was warped from the heat of her body and the fire. But the pages, the damning pages with Crow's handwriting and the deputy's signature, were intact. "This is dynamite," Elias said softly. "But if I take this back, Crow will kill me before I get to the judge." "Not the judge," Clara said. "Take it to Mr. Henderson, the station master at the stagecoach line. He hates Crow, and he has a telegraph." Elias weighed the book in his hand. He looked at the two of them, hunted, wounded, and alone. "If I go," Elias said, "I leave you with no eyes in the town. Crow will come looking. He knows you cannot get far with that wound." "Go," Sage said. "We will wait. We will hold on." Elias stood up. He tucked the ledger into his shirt, close to his skin. "Give me 12 hours. If I am not back with help, then you ride for Mexico." He vanished into the night as quickly as he had come. The hours after Elias left were the longest of Clara's life. The fever spiked, making her shiver violently despite the fire. Sage lay down beside her. He pulled his own buffalo hide coat over both of them. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her back against his chest, sharing his body heat. It was an intimacy born of survival, but it shifted into something else as the moon climbed high overhead. Clara turned in his arms, careful of her shoulder. She looked at him in the dying light of the embers. He was awake, his eyes watching the entrance of the overhang. "You should go," Sage said suddenly. His voice was tight. Clara blinked, confused by the fever. "Go where?" "When Elias comes back," Sage said. "Or, if he does not, you should go to the fort. Tell them I kidnapped you. Tell them I forced you. They will believe it. You will be a victim. They will forgive you." Clara stiffened. "Is that what you think I am, a coward?" "I think you are a white woman," Sage said brutally. "And I am a Comanche. There is no future for us in this world. If you stay with me, you will be an outcast. You will be hunted. You will never have a safe cabin again." He looked down at her. "I want you to be safe. I want you to be clean." Clara reached up with her good hand. She gripped the collar of his buckskin shirt. "I was clean when I lived in the settlement," she hissed. "And I was miserable. I was safe when I was building my cabin, and I was alone. Do not tell me what I want." She pulled him closer. "You think you can decide for me because you are a man, because you are a warrior. You are just like Arthur, just like Crow, trying to own my choices." Sage looked shocked. "I will try to save you." "I do not want to be saved," Clara said fiercely. "I want to be chosen, and I want to choose." She pressed her hand against his chest, over his heart. "I choose this. I choose the dirt and the cold and the fire. I chose the man who carried the wood for me." Sage's resolve crumbled. He let out a breath that sounded like a surrender. "Clara," he whispered. He lowered his head. This time, there was no hesitation, no asking for permission. The permission had been given in blood and smoke. He kissed her, and the kiss was desperate and deep. It was the taste of life claiming victory over death. His hands, usually so careful, moved over her body with a hunger that matched her own. He touched her face, her waist, the curve of her hip, mapping her as if she were a new territory he had to memorize before the sun took it away. Clara did not pull away. She pressed closer, ignoring the throb in her shoulder. She needed this. She needed to feel his weight, his heat, the rough texture of his skin. She needed to know that she was not just a victim of violence, but a creature capable of passion. They came together in the shadows of the canyon, on a bed of leaves and moss. It was not the gentle, romantic lovemaking of the storybooks she had read. It was urgent. It was raw. It was a reclaiming of their bodies from the pain that had been inflicted on them. When he entered her, Clara gasped, not from pain, but from the overwhelming sense of presence. He was there, entirely. And she was there with him. No one was selling her. No one was buying her. She was giving, and she was taking. Later, as they lay tangled together under the buffalo coat, the sweat cooling on their skin, Sage kissed the bandage on her shoulder. "I am not leaving," he vowed into her skin. "I will never leave." "Good," Clara murmured, drifting into a sleep that was finally, blissfully, dreamless. "Because I still need help building the roof." Morning came with the sound of a stone skittering down the canyon wall. Sage was awake instantly. He covered Clara's mouth with his hand, his eyes scanning the rim of the canyon above. He saw the glint of metal. "Crow," Sage whispered. He did not wait. He rolled away from Clara, grabbing his bow and his quiver. He had 2 arrows left. "They found us," he hissed. "Elias was too slow, or he was caught." Clara sat up, clutching the coat to her chest. The fever had broken, leaving her weak but clear-headed. "How many? I see 2, maybe 3. It was Silas Crow. He had not waited for the law. He had gathered the dregs of his payroll men who did not care about ledgers or truth. Only gold, and he had tracked them himself. He was desperate. He knew that if that book reached the telegraph office, he was a dead man walking. "Come out, Clara." Crow's voice echoed down the canyon walls, distorted and ghostly. "I know you are down there. I can smell the smoke." A shot rang out. A bullet struck the rock face 3 feet from their shelter, spraying stone chips. "Stay here," Sage commanded. "No," Clara said. She grabbed her revolver. It had 3 rounds left. "We fight." "He wants you," Sage said. "He wants a hostage to trade for the book." Sage moved to the edge of the overhang. He spotted Crow making his way down a narrow goat path on the far side of the ravine. He was alone on the path. His men were providing covering fire from the rim. Crow was exposed. Sage drew his bow. The pain in his leg screamed, but his arm was steady as stone. He aimed, but before he could lose the arrow, a bullet from the rim struck the ground near his feet, forcing him back. "Pin him down," Crow shouted. "I'm going in." Crow was sliding down the screen, a rifle in one hand. He was coming for the overhang. Sage looked at Clara. "Run, up the creek bed, the willows." "I cannot outrun him," Clara said. "You must," Sage said. "I will draw their fire." He did not give her time to argue. He burst from the cover of the overhang, not toward Crow, but into the open center of the ravine. He moved with a limping, jagged speed, screaming a Comanche war cry that bounced off the walls like thunder. The men on the rim turned their guns on him. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet. Crow hesitated on the slope, distracted by the target. That was the moment Clara needed. She did not run away. She ran toward Crow. She scrambled up the scree slope, her boots slipping on the loose rock. The pain in her shoulder was blinding, but rage was a potent anesthetic. Crow saw her. He swung his rifle around. "You stupid bitch!" he screamed. He fired. The shot went wide, buzzing past her ear like an angry hornet. Clara raised her revolver. She did not have the strength to aim steady. She just pointed it at the man who had burned her home. She pulled the trigger. Bang! The bullet struck the rock face right next to Crow's head. Rock shards peppered his face. He flinched, losing his footing on the treacherous slope. He slid. He tumbled 10 feet down, dropping his rifle. He landed in a heap at the bottom of the ravine, right in the muddy creek bed. Clara stood on the slope, panting, the gun smoking in her hand. Sage had reached the cover of a boulder. He had an arrow nocked, aimed right at Crow's chest. Crow scrambled to his knees, his face bloody from the fall. He looked up at Clara, then at Sage. He reached for the pistol at his belt. "Don't!" a voice thundered. It was not Sage. From the mouth of the canyon, where the creek widened into the valley, a group of riders appeared. At the lead was a man in a blue uniform, a United States cavalry officer. Beside him rode Elias Knox, and next to him was the station master, Mr. Henderson. And behind them were 10 men, the Vigilance Committee members who had walked away the night before. "Drop the gun! Silas!" the officer called out. "It is over." Crow froze. He looked at the cavalry. He looked at the ledger Elias was holding up for everyone to see. "It is a forgery!" Crow screamed, his voice cracking. "They are lying. He is a savage. She is a whore." "The only savage I see is you. Silas," Mr. Henderson shouted back. "We wired Austin. The governor is very interested in your accounting practices." Crow looked at his hired guns on the rim. They had already lowered their weapons. They were mercenaries. They did not fight for lost causes. Crow looked back at Sage. The warrior had not lowered his bow. The arrow was still pointed at Crow's heart. "Go ahead," Crow sneered, his eyes wild. "Kill me. Make me a martyr. Prove you are an animal." Sage looked at the man. He looked at the fear sweating through the expensive suit. He looked at the pathetic, small thing Crow had become now that his power was stripped away. Sage slowly lowered the bow. He unknocked the arrow and returned it to the quiver. "You are not worth the wood of my arrow." Sage said. He turned his back on Crow and walked toward the slope where Clara stood. The cavalry officer signaled his men. 2 soldiers rode forward, dismounted, and hauled Crow out of the mud. They took his gun and slapped iron cuffs on his wrists. Clara slid down the slope. Her legs gave out when she reached the bottom. Sage was there. He caught her. "We held," Clara whispered into his chest. "We held," Sage affirmed. Elias rode up to them. He jumped down, grinning through a split lip. "Told you to give me 12 hours, Elias said, though I admit, cutting it close with the army was a bit dramatic. "You brought the cavalry," Clara said, looking at the soldiers. "Mr. Henderson brought the cavalry," Elias corrected. "I just brought the truth." He handed the ledger back to Clara. "The officer needs this for evidence, but I thought you should be the one to hand it over." Clara took the battered book. She looked at Crow, who was being hoisted onto a horse, his hands bound. He refused to look at her. He was staring at the ground. A king of nothing. Clara walked over to the officer. She handed him the book. "Take it," she said, "and take him away from my land." "Your land, Miss Whitmore?" the officer asked, tipping his hat. "I believe the deed is secure, though I am afraid your cabin is, well, the cabin is wood," Clara said, repeating Sage's words. "I can cut more wood." She turned back to Sage. He was standing a little apart, watching the soldiers with that old, guarded expression. He was a Comanche in a canyon full of bluecoats. He expected the cuffs to come for him next. Clara walked to him. She did not care who was watching. She did not care about the soldiers or the townspeople. She took his hand. "Come," she said. "Where?" Sage asked, eyeing the officer. "To find a new spot." Clara said, "The old foundation is bad luck. I think we should build closer to the trees this time." Sage looked at her. He saw the resolve in her jaw, the love in her eyes. He saw the woman who had charged a gunman to save him. He looked at the feather he had given her, the one she had tucked into her belt before fleeing the fire. It was singed at the edges. The white bars turned gray by smoke, but the quill was unbroken. He smiled. It was a rare, genuine smile that transformed his face. "Closer to the trees is good," he said. They walked together out of the canyon, past the soldiers, past the prisoner, leading the tired horse with the charred beam strapped to the saddle. The wind blew through the valley, cold and fresh, carrying the scent of rain and new timber. The winter of 1858 was harsh, but the spring that followed was a revelation. The snowmelt roared down the creeks, turning the dry beds into rushing rivers of silver and cold blue. The valley, once brown and brittle with frost, erupted in a riot of color. Bluebonnets carpeted the hills, Indian paintbrushes splashed red against the limestone, and the willows along the water turned a vibrant, electric green. Clara Whitmore stood knee-deep in the soil of her new garden. It was situated 2 miles upstream from the blackened scar where her first cabin had stood. She did not visit the old site often. Nature was already doing the work of forgiveness there. Wild sunflowers and creeping vines were burying the charcoal remains, turning the site of violence into a feeding ground for bees and deer. She wiped her forehead with the back of her gloved hand. She was 23 now, though the mirror, if she had owned one, would have shown a woman who looked older. her skin browned by the sun and etched with the fine lines of a life lived outdoors. She wore trousers now, men's denim that she had tailored to fit her waist, and a loose cotton shirt. The dress she had arrived in, the one she had nearly died in, had been cut into strips for rugs and bandages. She had no use for skirts that caught in the briars. Her left shoulder still ached when the storms rolled in from the north. The scar was a thick, puckered line, a permanent reminder of the night the world burned. But she did not hide it. It was not a mark of shame. It was a receipt of purchase. She had paid for her life with her blood, and she owned every minute of it. "The post needs to be deeper." The voice came from behind her, carrying on the breeze. Clara turned. Sage was standing near the foundation of the new barn they were raising. He was shirtless, his chest slick with sweat, his long hair tied back with a strip of red cloth. The limp from the bear trap was almost gone, visible only when he was very tired or carrying a heavy load. He was holding a shovel, looking at the corner post of the structure. "It is 3 feet down," Clara argued, leaning on her hoe. "That is deep enough for a milk cow's shelter." Sage shook his head. "The wind blows harder here. We go 4 feet. We do not build for the cow. We build for the storm." Clara smiled. It was an old argument. He always wanted to build stronger, thicker, deeper. He built as if the apocalypse was due on Tuesday. "Fine," Clara said, walking over to him. 4 feet, but you are digging the extra foot." Sage's eyes crinkled at the corners. It was the closest he usually came to a laugh. "I dig. You plant. It is the way." They worked together in a rhythm that had taken months to perfect. There was no desperate scrambling now, no frantic race against winter or enemies. There was just the steady, measured pace of building a life. When the sun reached its zenith, they took their midday meal under the shade of a massive pecan tree. They ate cornbread and dried venison, drinking water from the creek that was so cold it made their teeth ache. Sage sat with his back against the tree, whittling a peg for the barn door. Clara lay on the grass, looking up at the leaves filtering the sunlight. "Elias is coming," Sage said suddenly. Without looking up from his work, Clara sat up. She scanned the horizon. She saw nothing but heat, shimmer, and grass. "How do you know?" "The birds," Sage said, pointing to a flock of crows rising from the southern ridge. "Something disturbed them, and the wind carries the smell of tobacco." 20 minutes later, a rider crested the hill. It was indeed Elias Knox. He rode a fine Appaloosa now, not the sway-backed nag he had borrowed from the trading post. He wore a clean vest and a hat with a silver band. He looked like a man who had found his place in the world. "Afternoon," Elias called out, waving his hat. He dismounted and walked into their camp, shaking Sage's hand and tipping his hat to Clara. "You look prosperous." "Elias," Clara said, pouring him a cup of coffee. "I am doing all right." Elias grinned. "The army pays well for a scout who knows the canyons. And the new settlers, well, they pay even better to be guided around the bad water." "News from the town?" Sage asked. He did not care about money, but he monitored the movements of the settlements like a hawk watching a snake. "Quiet as a church mouse," Elias said. "Since Crow went to the penitentiary in Huntsville, the Vigilance Committee fell apart. Half of them moved on to Arizona. The other half went back to farming. Turns out, without a rich man paying for whiskey and hate, most men just want to grow their corn in peace." "And Martha?" Clara asked. "Martha is the mayor in everything but name." Elias laughed. "She runs the town council from behind her counter. If a man wants to open a business in Pine Hollow, he has to get her blessing first. She told me to tell you that she has a bolt of blue silk set aside for you. Clara, whenever you are ready to stop dressing like a cowboy." Clara looked down at her trousers and smiled. "Tell her I will come for it, one day. But tell her not to hold her breath." Elias stayed for an hour, sharing news and tobacco. When he mounted his horse to leave, he looked at the two of them standing side by side, the white woman with the scar and the Comanche warrior with the quiet eyes. "You two have made a good place here," Elias said seriously. "Folks talk about it, Some say it is a scandal, some say it is strange, but mostly they just say it is strong. Let them talk, Sage said. Talk does not grow corn. Elias nodded. Ride easy. Friends. He turned his horse and galloped away, disappearing over the ridge. That evening, as the twilight settled purple and gold over the valley, Sage and Clara sat on the porch of their finished cabin. It was larger than the first one. It had 2 rooms and a stone chimney that drew perfectly. It had windows with real glass panes that Elias had brought from the city. But the most important feature was not inside. It was above the door. Fastened securely to the lintel was a piece of blackened, charred oak. It was the crossbeam from the first cabin, the one Sage had dragged through the fire and the night. The carving of the anchor, the circle, and the line was still visible, stark white against the burnt wood where Clara had scrubbed the soot away. Clara looked at it. Do you think we should have painted it? She asked. It looks violent. Life is violent, Sage said. Survival is violent. We do not hide the scar. We show it. It says to the storm, we have burned, and we are still here. He turned to her. The light was fading, casting his face in shadow. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small pouch. I have something, he said. He opened the pouch and poured a small pile of beads onto the porch railing. They were old, made of turquoise and silver. My mother made these, he said quietly, for the woman I would choose. She died before she could give them. Clara touched the cool stones. They are beautiful. Sage took her hand. He did not look at the beads. He looked at her face. You call me Sage, he said. It is a good name. It is the name of a healing plant. It is the name the traders gave me because I was quiet. He paused, taking a breath. But it is not the name my father shouted when I was born. It is not the name the wind knows. Clara's heart beat faster. She knew what this was. In his culture, a true name was a sacred thing, a piece of the soul given only to those who held your life in their hands. Tell me, she whispered. My name is Tuvako, he said, the syllables rolling off his tongue like water over stones. It means the sun on the horizon, not the high sun that burns, the low sun, the one that promises the light is coming, or the one that promises the rest is near. Clara repeated it slowly. Tuvako. He nodded. You do not have to use it. Sage is fine. But I wanted you to know who is sitting beside you. Clara laced her fingers through his. Tuvako, she said again, testing the weight of it. I like it. It fits you. You were the light on the horizon when I was in the dark. And you, he said, lifting her hand to his lips. You are the earth that caught the light. He looked out at the darkening valley. I will not ask you to marry me in your church. I cannot kneel before a priest who thinks my spirit is wrong. I do not need a priest, Clara said firmly. And I do not need a piece of paper from the courthouse. Those papers are just like the ledgers Crow kept. They try to own things. She turned to him, her eyes fierce and clear. I choose you. Tuvako, I choose you every morning when I wake up, and I choose you every night when I close my eyes. That is my vow, and I will make it again tomorrow. And the day after that. Sage looked at her with a profound, quiet joy. Then it is done. The wind is our witness. Months turned into years. The cabin weathered to a silver gray, blending into the landscape of cottonwoods and limestone. The garden expanded, yielding corn, squash, and beans that Clara preserved in jars lined up on her pantry shelves like jewels. They were not isolated. They traded with the honest ranchers. They visited Martha in town. They saw the world changing around them. The stagecoach line expanded. The telegraph poles marched further west, stringing their copper wire like a web across the sky. But they remained apart from the rush of it. They lived on the edge, where the fences ended and the open range began. One afternoon, late in autumn, Clara stood by the creek. She was watching a hawk circle high above, riding the thermals. She felt a presence beside her. She did not jump. She knew the rhythm of his walk, the sound of his breath. Sage stood next to her. He was older now, the gray touching his temples, but he was still straight and strong as a cedar post. The winter will be hard, he said, reading the sky. We have wood, Clara said. We have food. We have each other, Sage added. Clara looked at him. Do you ever regret it staying? You could have gone north to the reservation with the rest of your band. You could have been with your people. Sage looked at the cabin, where smoke curled lazily from the chimney. He looked at the horses grazing in the paddock. He looked at the woman standing beside him, her hand resting easily on his arm. My people are the people of the wind, Sage said. We go where we are free. He turned to her, his dark eyes full of the horizon he was named for. I was a warrior without a war, he said. I was a scout without a path. Then I saw a girl fighting a log in the mud, and I found my war. I found my path. He touched the scar on her shoulder through her shirt. Freedom is not being alone. Clara, I learned this. Freedom is looking at the heavy thing, the log, the fire, the fear, and having someone say, I will lift the other end. Clara smiled, tears stinging her eyes. She leaned her head against his shoulder. We lifted it, she whispered. Yes, Sage said. We did. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves of the cottonwoods. It was a cold wind, carrying the scent of snow from the mountains. But it did not bite. It blew past them, around them, and over the sturdy roof of the cabin that held the charred beam. They stood there for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon. They did not need to speak. They did not need to move. They were exactly where they had chosen to be. The world was wide and wild and dangerous, but they were not lost. They were found, because when they looked at the future, they were finally, truly, looking in the same direction. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Clara and Sage. It has been a journey of fire, courage, and the true meaning of freedom. I would love to hear from you. Please comment below and tell me where you are listening from. It is always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more stories about the spirit of the frontier, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Hit that like button and give the video a hype to help this story reach more people. Your support keeps the campfire burning. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.